Hey there. Honestly, I was just sitting here by the fire, thinking about how we get so annoyed when our modern heaters make that tiny metallic clicking sound in the middle of the night. While just 2 centuries ago, people were lying in the dark, listening to the very bones of their houses groan under the weight of an ice age that simply would not end. You know that feeling when the air gets so cold it feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest? Well, imagine that being your entire life for months on end, in a tiny room made of nothing but trees and mud. Tonight we are going on a journey into the quiet, frozen heart of the early 1800s to discover the hidden rituals of survival. For frontier families living in one-room log cabins, staying warm through a sub-zero night was not a matter of comfort. It was an engineering feat of fire, wood, and wool. You might wonder how they slept without freezing when the ink turned to ice in the well and the wind roared through the trees. The answer lies in a forgotten system of thermal mass, the alchemy of the backlog, and the prized hierarchy of the featherbed. Before we step into the dim light of the hearth to see how they mastered the cold, I would love for you to gently tap that like button and subscribe to our Quiet Hall of History. It really helps me keep these nightly fires burning for us. Now, I want you to settle in. Really settle in. Take a moment to dim the lights around you if you have not already. Feel the weight of your body pressing into your bed. Let the tension in your jaw just melt away, and slow your breathing until it matches the soft rhythm of a sleeping house. We are going back to a world where the wilderness pressed against thin wooden walls, and every breath was a small victory against the cold. The early 1800s in North America were actually much colder than most of us realize today, because the Little Ice Age had not yet released its freezing grip on the Northern Hemisphere. This was a long climatic period that had begun all the way back in the 1300s, and it would continue to hold the Earth in a shivering embrace until around 1850. Imagine a world where the seasons were squeezed into a tiny window, where spring arrived late, with a tired sigh, and summer vanished before it could even get warm. For the European settlers arriving in this new world, it was a shock that no map could have prepared them for. They assumed that if they were at the same latitude as the homes they left behind, the weather would surely be the same. But the heart of North America played by different rules entirely. The winters were not just cold. They were brutal sieges. The temperature records from this time are incomplete, but the patterns of the frost tell a clear and terrifying story. Rivers that stayed liquid for the rest of human history became solid highways of ice, thick enough to support heavy wagons and teams of horses. Harbors stayed frozen well into the months when flowers should have been blooming, and the snowfall was so deep and lasted so long that the very shape of the landscape was hidden under a white shroud for half the year. The sun itself seemed to be tired during this era, a period known to scientists today as the Dalton minimum. From the 1790s through the 1830s, solar activity declined, and the Earth received just a tiny bit less warmth from above. It was only about 1 degree Celsius in absolute terms, but that small change was enough to move the line between life and death. Growing seasons shrank, and the frost began to arrive earlier in the autumn and linger much later in the spring. Crops that had been reliable for generations suddenly became uncertain, leaving families to stare at their empty fields with a growing sense of dread. But then, nature decided to add a spectacular tragedy to the existing cold. In 1815, a volcano named Mount Tambora erupted in Indonesia with a force that the world had rarely seen. It ejected 37 cubic kilometers of material into the sky, creating a thick, and suffocating aerosol cloud that spread across the entire globe like a gray veil. This cloud scattered the sunlight before it could ever reach the soil, and the year that followed became known as the year without a summer. If you were standing in New England or the mid-Atlantic in 1816, you would have seen frost in every single month of the year. Imagine waking up in June to see snow falling on your newly planted corn. Farmers watched in absolute silence as their crops froze on the vine, and animals shivered in fields that were covered with sheets of ice in the middle of what should have been the growing season. The phrase 1800 and froze to death became a common way of speaking, and honestly, it was not hyperbole at all. It was a marker of trauma, a memory of a year when the earth seemed to have forgotten how to be warm. Families who thought they knew the limits of the cold found out they were mistaken, and the psychological weight of that hunger and that frost changed the way an entire generation thought about survival. They learned that preparation could never be put off, and every autumn became a ritual of fortifying their homes against an adversary that was unpredictable and indifferent. Inside a frontier cabin, winter was not a season to be enjoyed by the fire with a book. It was a siege to be endured. The air became sharp and still, and the world outside grew vast and gray. Inside the single room of the cabin, the family gathered around a fire that could never be allowed to die, because the cold was not an abstract idea. It was a physical presence that tried to enter through every crack. It pulled on the floorboards and seeped through the spaces where the logs did not meet perfectly. It condensed on the interior walls until frost formed inside the house, and it would not melt until the fire was built back up in the morning. Every opening was a breach in the defense, and the settlers had to become experts in the materials of the earth to keep the warmth inside. They relied on an understanding of wood and fire and wool and feathers that we have mostly forgotten in our age of buttons and thermostats. I often find it strange to think about the patience required for this kind of life. When Mount Tambora exploded, the sound was heard over 1,000 miles away, and the island where it stood literally lost a meter of its height. The ash stayed suspended in the stratosphere for months, circulating and reflecting the sun away, and the result was a cooling that lasted for more than a year. By the summer of 1816, the seedlings in North America were dying as soon as they emerged from the soil. The timing was catastrophic because agriculture depended on such a narrow window of warmth. If the frost arrived even a few weeks early, the yields fell. But that year, the window was almost completely erased. Corn failed across entire regions, and while potatoes were a bit more resilient, they could not save everyone from the hungry winter that followed. Grain prices soared, and families had to make impossible choices about which livestock to slaughter early because there was no feed left to keep them alive. The memory of 1816 lingered like a ghost in the minds of the people, and it became the standard by which all future winters were measured. They would ask themselves every year if they were ready for another year without a summer. This fear shaped their every move. They stockpiled more wood than they thought they could ever use. They expanded their root cellars to hold extra carrots and potatoes and preserved meat, and they invested every spare bit of energy into heavier blankets. They told stories of neighbors who ran out of wood in February, or livestock that froze because their barns were not tight enough. These stories were warnings that kept everyone vigilant, and for the families on the frontier, every winter was a test of their will to survive. The cabin had to be tight, the bedding had to be adequate, and the routines of the fire had to be followed without fail. There was simply no room for laziness or complacency. The cold was a force that could take the young and the old and the sick with a quiet and freezing efficiency. The line between safety and danger was very narrow, and it was kept in place only by constant effort. They prepared in the heat of the summer by gathering the wood. They prepared in the autumn by repairing the walls. And they prepared every single evening as the sun dipped below the horizon and the temperature began its long and steady drop. This was the world shaped by the Little Ice Age, and it was the environment where Americans had to find a way to sleep without freezing. Before they could even think about building a home, they had to study the forest around them with a very careful eye. Not every tree was meant to be a wall. They needed wood that was straight enough to stack and strong enough to carry the roof, but it also had to have the right thermal properties to keep the cabin habitable. In the southern regions, they used the tulip poplar because it grew tall and straight and was soft enough to work quickly with basic tools. In the Midwest and the Northeast, they preferred the oak, which was dense and strong and resisted the weather for decades. Choosing the right wood was the very first decision in a long chain of survival. Ash was valued for how it split cleanly and for the steady heat it provided as firewood, while locust was prized because it almost never rotted even when driven into the damp ground. The forest dictated the architecture, and the architecture shaped the lives of everyone inside. Once the trees were chosen, they were felled in the late autumn or winter when the sap was at its lowest point, because wood cut in the cold was less likely to warp as it dried over the coming months. The logs were trimmed and stripped of their bark, which was the first layer of vulnerability. Bark held moisture and invited insects to feed on the wood, so removing it was essential for creating a home that would last more than a year. They used a tool called a barking spud, a flat blade forged from scrap iron, to peel the bark away in long and satisfying strips. This work was tedious and slow, but it was the foundation of everything. Once the logs were stripped, they were left to season and dry, though many families in a hurry to build their first shelter used green wood and just accepted that the house would shift and shrink as the seasons passed. A typical cabin was small, perhaps 12 to 18 feet on each side, and the logs were cut and notched to lock together at the corners using nothing but gravity and friction. No nails were needed because the weight of the logs themselves held the structure together like a massive wooden puzzle. The thickness of those walls was the most important factor in keeping the heat inside. Thicker logs provided more thermal mass, which is just a fancy way of saying they could absorb heat during the day and release it slowly throughout the long and freezing night. Imagine the sun hitting the exterior of those logs on a bright winter day. The warmth would slowly penetrate the wood, moving from the outside toward the inside molecule by molecule. It was a very slow process, and a thick log acted as a thermal buffer that smoothed out the wild temperature swings between the day and the night. The cabin would stay cooler during the day, but remain significantly warmer at night as the wood breathed the stored heat back into the living space. The people of that time might not have used modern scientific words for this, but they knew from generations of experience that thick logs kept you alive longer. They knew which woods burned the hottest and which logs at the back of the fireplace would radiate warmth for the longest time. This knowledge was passed down from parent to child as a sacred inheritance, embedded in the very way they built their walls and managed their hearths. The selection of the wood was the boundary between life and death, and as the logs were stacked, they became more than just a house. They became a reservoir for the very heat of the family. I love to think about the silence of that forest as the work was being done. The sound of the barking spud scraping against the wood, the sharp scent of fresh sap in the cold air, and the feeling of the heavy logs sliding into place. Wood is not as dense as stone, but it has that wonderful property of absorbing warmth slowly and letting it go even slower. That lag time is what made a log cabin a viable place to live when the temperature outside dropped far below zero. Even in the middle of winter, the sun provided a little bit of energy, and the logs would drink it up, holding on to it until the sun set and the air turned sharp enough to cut. By evening, the flow of heat would reverse, and the walls themselves would start to glow with a warmth that the fire alone could not provide. This effect was strongest when the logs were hewn flat, allowing them to touch each other more closely and create a better connection for the heat to travel through. Round logs were faster to prepare, but they left wider gaps that required more work to seal. And on the frontier, sometimes speed was the only thing that mattered when the clouds of November began to gather in the sky. Orientation was another trick they used to stay alive. A cabin with its longest wall facing the south would catch more of the low winter sun, acting like a giant battery for solar energy. Not everyone had the luxury of choosing where their house sat, as they often had to follow the water or the slope of the land. But they always aimed for that southern exposure when they could. Different woods had different personalities too. Oak was like a steady old friend, absorbing a lot of heat and holding it for a very long time, while pine was a bit more flighty, warming up fast but losing its heat just as quickly. Hickory was the king of thermal storage, but it was so hard that it could break your tools and your spirit if you were not careful. Over a long winter, these small differences in the wood could mean the difference between cutting 10 loads of firewood or 12, and that extra labor was a high price to pay. The thermal battery of the logs only worked if you managed the fire correctly, banking it at night so it would smolder and provide a low level of heat that the walls could amplify. The goal was never to make the cabin hot. It was just to keep it from becoming a tomb of ice. The logs were the first defense, the heavy armor of the house. But the gaps between them were the weak points where the winter tried to find its way in. No two trees grow exactly the same, and when you stack them, they leave openings that can be narrow or wide, all of them inviting the freezing wind to whistle through the room. On a still night, the air inside might stay calm, but as soon as the wind picked up, the cabin became a passage for freezing air that could pull the warmth right out of your skin. This is why the work of chinking and daubing was just as vital as the cutting of the logs themselves. Chinking was the process of stuffing solid materials like stones or wood chunks into the larger gaps, while daubing was the application of a mortar-like sealant over the top to make the whole thing airtight. In the late autumn, every family would perform a careful inspection, walking around their walls to look for places where the light shone through or where a draft could be felt. It was a race against the first hard freeze, and the integrity of those seals determined exactly how much the family would shiver in the months to come. I can almost see the family working together in the fading light of October, the children gathering flat stones from the creek bed and the parents wedging them into the gaps with focused patience. They used whatever was at hand, scraps of bark, pieces of old shingles, or even dry moss from the damp corners of the woods. Sphagnum moss was a favorite because it stayed springy and trapped air perfectly. acting like a natural layer of insulation that kept the wind at bay. They would roll clay into ropes and press it into the crevices, sometimes mixing it with straw or animal hair to give it flexibility so it would not crack as the logs shifted in the cold. It was a repetitive and unglamorous job, but there was a quiet peace in it, a sense of closing the door on the world and making the home a safe harbor. Even the best chinking could not stop every draft, and the floor remained a constant source of cold, with freezing air rising between the planks to pull the heat away from the ground. This is why the beds were always slightly elevated and kept away from the walls, perched in a middle zone of air that was just a few degrees warmer than the frost on the floor. The goal was always survival, and every handful of mud pressed into a crack was a promise to make it through to the spring. The process of sealing a frontier cabin was never truly finished, because as the wood aged and the earth shifted, new gaps would always appear, like tiny wounds in the side of the house. After the rigid filler of stones and wood was packed tight into the spaces between the logs, the family moved on to the soft chinking, which required a much more delicate touch. They used mosses and clays and sometimes even old rags or shredded newspaper to fill every remaining void. I have always thought it must have been a very strange and intimate thing to spend your days intimately touching every inch of your walls, knowing that a single missed spot could let in a draft that might make your child sick in the middle of January. They would mix wet clay with straw, kneading it with their hands or even their bare feet until it reached the consistency of a thick porridge. And then they would press it deep into the seams. The straw acted like a skeleton for the mud, giving it the strength to hold together even as it dried and shrank under the heat of the fireplace. If a family was lucky enough to live near a source of lime, they would add it to their daubing mixture to create a finish that was much harder and more durable than plain mud. Lime was a luxury, though, and most people had to make do with the dirt beneath their feet, working it until it was smooth and could be spread across the chinking to create a solid and airtight surface. They would work from both the inside and the outside of the cabin, because a gap that looked small from one side might actually be quite wide on the other, and only by sealing both could they truly trap the air inside. This double layer of protection was essential for creating the tight envelope that allowed a single fire to keep a whole family from freezing. In the autumn, the fresh daubing would be a dark and wet brown, but as it dried over several days, it would turn into a pale tan or gray, signaling that the house was finally ready for the siege of winter. The floor was often the hardest part to manage, especially if the cabin was built directly on the ground. Some families had the time to saw planks, but others just had packed earth, which was surprisingly good at holding heat but also incredibly damp. Even with floorboards, the cold would rise up from the dark spaces below, and you had to be very careful where you placed your feet when you stepped out of bed in the dark. I have often wondered how they felt, waking up to see the wash basin frozen solid just a few feet away from where they slept, a reminder that the warmth was a fragile thing that only extended as far as the fire could reach. The fireplace was the metabolic heart of the entire structure, and without it, the logs and the chinking were just a cold pile of materials. It was not just a place to cook or a source of light. It was the engine of life, and its placement was the most important decision in the cabin design. In the coldest regions, they would build the chimney entirely inside the walls so that every bit of heat from the stones would radiate back into the room rather than being lost to the outside air. A chimney on an exterior wall was easier to build, but it was like throwing away half of your firewood, and for a family that had to cut every log by hand, that was a cost they could not afford. Stone fireplaces were the best, built from flat rocks, stacked and mortared together into a massive structure that could hold heat for hours after the flames died down. But stone was heavy and hard to find in some areas, which led to the invention of the cat and clay chimney, a strange and dangerous structure made of nothing but sticks and mud. They would build a wooden framework of oak poles and then wrap them in rolls of clay and straw called cats, stacking them up to form a flue that would carry the smoke away. I have always found it terrifyingly brave to live in a house where your chimney is made of wood, but that was the reality for many people on the frontier. They knew it was a risk, and they kept a long pry pole near the hearth so that if the chimney caught fire, they could simply push the whole thing away from the cabin before the rest of the house ignited. Imagine standing in the snow at midnight, watching your chimney burn on the ground while you stood in the cold, thankful that at least your walls were still standing. The maintenance of a cat and clay chimney was a never-ending job, as the heat would cause the clay to crack and peel, exposing the wood underneath to the fire. They would have to climb up and patch the cracks with fresh mud constantly, a task that was difficult and dangerous in the middle of a winter storm. The firebox was the actual burning chamber, and it had to be designed with a very specific geometry to reflect the heat forward into the room. A well-built fireplace had a back wall that tilted slightly forward at the top, acting like a mirror for the infrared energy of the coals. The throat of the chimney was the narrow part that controlled the draft, and if it was too wide, the heat would just roar up the flue and vanish. But if it was too narrow, the cabin would fill with a thick and stinging smoke that made it impossible to breathe. It was a delicate balance that required a lot of skill to get right, and every fireplace had its own personality and its own quirks that the family had to learn over time. They would manage the draft by piling ash over the coals or by changing the size of the logs they used, a constant dance of adjustments that lasted from the first frost to the final thaw. Fire management was a ritual that governed the entire day and night, and they never allowed the fire to go out if they could help it. During the daylight hours, the fire burned openly and brightly, but as evening approached, they began the process of banking the coals for the night. They would rake the glowing embers into a mound at the back of the fireplace and cover them with a thick blanket of ash to restrict the oxygen and keep them smoldering slowly until morning. This was an art form, and if you used too much ash, you would smother the fire completely. But if you used too little, the coals would burn through before midnight and leave the cabin freezing. I can imagine the quiet tension of that nightly routine, the sound of the iron poker scraping against the stone, and the soft hiss of the heat being tucked away for the night. The backlog was the most important part of the banked fire, a massive log of hickory or oak that was placed at the very rear of the fireplace to act as a slow-burning reservoir of heat. Hickory was the best because it was so dense and held so much energy, burning with a steady and intense glow that could last for 8 or 10 hours. They would choose their backlogs with great care in the autumn, looking for the thickest and most solid pieces of wood and setting them aside specifically for the long winter nights. A good backlog was like a battery that kept the cabin from dropping into sub-zero temperatures while the family slept, radiating a gentle warmth that supplemented the heat stored in the log walls. By morning, the backlog would be charred and smaller, but it would still be holding a core of fire that could be used to revive the hearth for the new day. I sometimes think about the first person who woke up in those cabins. The father, or the eldest son, stepping out onto the cold floor in the gray light of dawn to see if the fire had survived. They would take the poker and carefully pull back the ash to reveal the glowing red heart of the coals, a sight that must have been the most beautiful thing in the world on a freezing morning. They would add small bits of dry kindling and blow softly on the embers until a tiny flame appeared, and then they would build the fire back up until the cabin began to breathe again. This cycle of banking and reviving was the heartbeat of the home, a constant reminder that life required effort and vigilance every single day. If the fire did go out, someone would have to walk through the snow to a neighbor's house to borrow a shovel full of hot coals, a humbling and cold journey that no one wanted to make. The bed was the other half of the survival system, and it was far more complex than just a mattress on a frame. Most families used rope beds, which were wooden frames with hemp cords stretched across them in a tight grid to support the weight of the sleepers. The tension in those ropes was critical, and they used a wooden tool called a bed wrench to tighten them periodically as they stretched over time. I love the fact that the phrase "sleep tight" actually comes from this practice, because if your ropes were loose, the bed would sag and you would end up in a cold and uncomfortable pile in the middle of the night. A tight bed kept the mattresses flat and allowed the layers of insulation to work much more effectively, trapping your body heat where it belonged. The mattresses themselves were built in a hierarchy of materials, with each layer serving a specific purpose in the battle against the cold. The bottom layer was usually a tick filled with straw or corn husks, which provided a lot of bulk and loft, but was incredibly noisy and flattened out quickly. Straw was free and abundant, so they would empty the ticks every spring and refill them with fresh stalks after the harvest. Above the straw came the wool or horsehair mattresses, which were much firmer and provided better insulation without the rustling sound of the straw. Wool was a precious commodity, shorn from the family sheep and carded by hand to create a soft and springy filler that could wick moisture away from the body. The ultimate luxury was the feather bed, a thick quilt filled with the down and soft feathers of geese or ducks, which was placed on the very top of the mattress stack. A good feather bed was a family heirloom, often listed in wills and passed down through generations because it took years of plucking and stripping to gather enough feathers to fill one. They would sit by the fire in the winter evenings, stripping the stiff quills out of the feathers to leave only the soft barbs behind, a tedious job that required thousands of feathers for a single bed. The feather bed was like a warm cocoon that you could sink into, the down trapping your body heat in millions of tiny air pockets that the cold could not penetrate. Every morning, the feather bed had to be shaken and fluffed to restore its loft, a task that was part of the daily chores for the women and children of the house. If you did not fluff it, the feathers would compact and lose their ability to hold heat, and the bed would become lumpy and cold. I can almost smell the scent of the bedding, a mix of dry straw and wool, and the faint earthy smell of the feathers, all of it holding the warmth of the family through the long, dark hours. They would layer heavy wool blankets on top of the feather bed, sometimes 5 or 6 deep, until the weight of the covers was enough to pin you to the mattress. This weight was actually helpful, as it pressed the layers together and closed any gaps where the warm air might escape. Clothing was the final layer of defense, and no one went to bed in the thin fabrics we use today. They wore long nightshirts made of linsey woolsey, a coarse and scratchy blend of linen and wool that was incredibly durable and warm. Everyone wore a nightcap, usually made of flannel or knitted wool, because they knew that a huge amount of heat was lost through the head. The nightcap was not a fashion statement. It was a piece of survival gear that kept your ears from freezing and your body heat from radiating away into the rafters. They would wear thick wool stockings too, sometimes 2 pairs if the night was particularly bitter, and they would wrap themselves in shawls or extra coats if the fire was low. I have always found it fascinating how they used heated stones or bricks to pre-warm the bed before they climbed in. They would place smooth river rocks near the fire in the evening and then wrap them in pieces of old cloth and tuck them down by the foot of the bed. This would take the chill out of the sheets and give your feet a source of warmth that lasted for hours while you fell asleep. Some wealthier families had copper warming pans with long handles that they would fill with hot coals and slide between the blankets. But for most people, a simple hot stone was the only heater they had. It was a world where every bit of warmth was borrowed and managed with absolute care. A constant negotiation between the family and the freezing night. Privacy was something they simply gave up in exchange for heat, and the entire family would often sleep in the same bed or in trundle beds pulled close together. The combined body heat of 2 or 3 people was a powerful resource, and they would huddle together under the blankets to share their warmth. Children would sleep 3 or 4 to a bed, and even guests were expected to share a spot with the family members if the cabin was full. It was a communal way of living that fostered a deep sense of connection and interdependence, where your survival literally depended on the person lying next to you. I can imagine the sound of the family breathing in the dark, a rhythmic and comforting noise that filled the small space of the cabin while the wind howled outside. The morning light would reveal frost on the blankets, where their breath had condensed and frozen during the night, a silent witness to how cold the room had actually become. They would wake up with their noses cold and their limbs stiff, but they were alive, and that was enough. They would scramble out of bed and into their heavy clothes as fast as they could, rushing to the fire to begin the ritual of the new day. The ice age was outside, but inside, the fire was still glowing, and the wood was still warm, and the family was still whole. This was the reality of sleep in the 1800s, a quiet and heroic struggle that was repeated night after night, winter after winter, for generations. It is a reminder of how resilient we are as a species, and how much we can endure when we have a warm heart and a solid wall to protect us. The work of sealing a frontier cabin was never a singular event. It was a long and meditative conversation between the family and the very wood they had stacked for their protection. Honestly, if you were to stand beside one of these cabins in late October, you would hear a sound that has almost entirely vanished from our modern world. The steady and rhythmic thud of mallets wedging stones into narrow gaps. This was the beginning of chinking, the first crucial step in building the boundary between the shivering cold and the life within. No 2 logs ever sat perfectly flush against each other, as each tree had spent a century growing in its own unique way, twisting slightly toward the sun or bending under the weight of an ice storm long ago. When these logs were stacked, they created a skeleton of gaps, pathways where the winter wind waited to enter and steal the warmth of the hearth. You know that feeling when a tiny draft finds its way through a window frame and touches the back of your neck, making you shiver even in a heated room? Well, for the pioneers, a single hairline crack was not an annoyance. It was an invitation for the little ice age to take up residence in their beds. Think for a moment about the mallets they used. These were not factory-made tools with plastic handles. They were heavy pieces of seasoned hickory or oak, carved by hand until the grip felt like an extension of the palm. You can feel the weight of it in your hand right now. The balance of the wood, the way the grain feels rough and honest against your skin. Every strike of the mallet was a deliberate choice, a declaration of intent against the encroaching frost. The sound it made was not a sharp metallic bang, but a deep, wooden thunk that echoed through the quiet clearing, a heartbeat for the house. The rhythmic nature of this work was hypnotic, a repetitive motion that allowed the mind to drift while the body remained focused on the stone. You would watch the father move along the seam. His eyes narrowed as he searched for the exact point of entry for the next piece of stone. The process began with the rigid filler, usually stones gathered from the frozen beds of nearby creeks. I can imagine the children spending their days walking through the shallow water, their fingers numb and red from the cold, looking for just the right size of limestone or flint. Imagine the creek as it was in October, the water crystal clear and biting cold, with thin sheets of ice beginning to form, like jagged glass along the muddy edges. The children would reach into the stream, their sleeves pulled back, feeling the slick surface of the rocks under the water. They would lift a stone, turning it over in their small hands, judging its thickness and its weight. They were looking for flat shards, pieces of the earth that had been polished by 1,000 years of moving water. These stones had to be flat enough to slide into the openings, but thick enough to stay lodged when the weight of the logs shifted as the house began to groan. There is something profoundly calm about the mental focus required to sort these stones, feeling their weight and their rough textures, searching for the one piece that fits the puzzle perfectly. You would see piles of these stones arranged by size around the cabin, little mounds of gray and tan and white, each one waiting for its place in the wall. The father would take a stone, perhaps a piece of blue-gray limestone, and place it into the gap, tapping it with that wooden mallet until it sang with a solid and certain resonance. If the stone was too small, it would rattle and fall through, and if it was too large, it would crack the dry wood of the logs. It was a slow and repetitive dance, moving foot by foot around the entire circumference of the cabin, filling hundreds of openings with the hard and silent history of the earth. You would see him kneeling in the dirt, his knees damp and his breath a white plume in the air, working his way from the bottom sill toward the roofline. Once the stones were in place, the second layer began, the soft chinking that provided the actual insulation. In the deep woods, they relied on what the forest floor offered most generously, the moss. Sphagnum moss was the treasure of the frontier, a soft and springy plant that felt like damp velvet under the hand. It grew in the shadows of the tall pines, drinking the moisture of the earth and the mist of the mornings. When you look at moss under a magnifying glass, you see a world of microscopic branches, a dense jungle of green that holds onto the air with a desperate grip. The pioneers would gather it in massive baskets, carrying the weight of the forest back to the clearing. I have always thought about the scent of that moss, a mix of old rain and decaying leaves and deep, green life. It was a clean smell, the scent of a world that was still wild and untouched. To seal the gaps, they would take a handful of this moss, often damp with the morning dew, and stuff it deep into the crevices behind the stones. They would use a thin stick to push the moss into every tiny corner, pressing it against the stones until it was packed tight. The beauty of moss was its loft, the millions of tiny air pockets trapped within its fibers that acted as a barrier against the movement of heat. Air is the greatest insulator we have, and the pioneers understood this intuitively, using the porous structure of the moss to hold the stillness inside their walls. You can imagine the feeling of the moss as it resists your fingers, the way it springs back when you release the pressure, like a living cushion that wants to protect you. They would work the moss into the seams until not a single pinpoint of light could be seen through the walls, turning the cabin into a dark and lightless box of safety. But moss alone was not enough to stop a March blizzard, and that is where the mud entered the story. They would find a patch of clay-rich soil near the riverbank and begin the laborious work of making the daubing. This clay was the heavy glue of the frontier, a sticky and stubborn material that had to be worked until it was supple. Imagine the feeling of cold, wet mud between your toes as you trample the clay to break down the lumps, mixing it with water until it reaches the consistency of a thick, heavy porridge. You would stand in a wooden trough or a hole in the ground, your legs covered in the gray-green slime of the earth, feeling the grit of the sand and the smoothness of the clay. It was a grounding experience, a physical union with the land that would soon become your fortress. To give the mud strength, they added straw or dried grass, sometimes even animal hair collected during the spring shearing. Think about the straw for a moment, the golden remains of the wheat harvest, dried in the summer sun until it was brittle and hollow. Each strand of straw was a tiny tube of air, adding its own insulating power to the mix. When the straw was kneaded into the clay, it acted like the iron rebar in modern concrete, providing a tensile strength that prevented the clay from crumbling as it dried. Honestly, there is something very ancient about touching the earth in this way, working it with your hands until it is smooth and pliable. You become part of the house, your own fingerprints pressed into the very seams that will keep you alive. You would feel the clay begin to stiffen under your hands as the air touched it, a race against time to get it onto the walls before it became too hard to move. The application of the daubing was a sensory experience that lasted for days. They would take a handful of the wet, heavy mixture and press it over the moss and stones, smoothing it with their palms or a wooden trowel until the surface was flush with the wood. The coldness of the mud would seep into your skin, but the movement of the work kept your blood flowing. It was a double defense, applied from both the inside and the outside of the logs. By sealing both sides, they created a dead air space in the middle, a pocket of trapped atmosphere that served as a thermal buffer. Imagine the interior of the cabin as the work progressed, the smell of the damp earth filling the room, the walls turning from the dark brown of the wood to the wet gray of the fresh mud. As the daubing dried, it would change color, fading from a dark and earthy brown to a pale, ghostly tan or a soft gray. I've always found it beautiful how the house would slowly change its appearance, almost as if it were putting on its winter coat in preparation for the first snow. The air inside the cabin would change too, as the drafts were slowly silenced one by one. The frantic flickering of the candlelight would steady, and the roar of the wind outside would become a muffled and distant murmur. The silence that followed a completed wall was a heavy and comforting hush, a weight of stillness that settled over the room like a blanket. You could finally blow out the candle and sit in the dark, feeling the logs release the heat of the day, knowing that the wind was no longer your roommate. There was a profound psychological shift that happened when the last gap was sealed. You could finally close the heavy wooden door, a slab of oak 3 inches thick, and feel that you were truly inside. Separated from the vast and indifferent wilderness, the cabin became a tight envelope, a sanctuary where the fire could finally do its work without the constant struggle against the entering cold. But this seal was fragile, and the people knew it. Wood is a living material, even after it has been cut and stacked, and as the winter deepened and the humidity dropped, the logs would shrink and twist in the dry air of the fireplace. You would hear them in the middle of the night, loud cracks like pistol shots echoing through the room as the wood adjusted to the freezing temperatures. These movements would create new gaps, tiny fractures in the daubing that the family would have to patch as soon as the sun rose. Vigilance was the price of warmth. They would walk the perimeter of the room every morning, checking for the white frost that formed where the air was leaking in. You know that delicate pattern of frost on a window pane. Well, for the pioneers, that same pattern on the wall was a warning sign, a map of the failures in their armor. They would reach out and touch the wall, feeling with their hands for the telltale touch of a cold draft, a needle of ice air that could drop the temperature of the room by 10 degrees in an hour. I can see the mother of the house sitting by the fire, keeping a small bucket of wet clay nearby just for these repairs. She would notice the way the smoke from her pipe or the steam from the kettle would drift toward a certain corner, revealing an invisible breach in the defense. She would stand and press a bit of mud into the crack, smoothing it with a practiced thumb, a tiny act of survival that was repeated thousands of times over a single winter. It was an intimate relationship with the structure, a constant mending of the vessel that carried them through the storm. In our modern world, we rarely touch our walls. But for the pioneers, the walls were something they nurtured and maintained with their own hands. Every handful of clay was a promise to the children that they would wake up in the morning, and every stone was a shield against the silence of the frost. Think about the texture of that daubing once it had fully cured. It felt like soft stone, slightly cool to the touch, but solid and reassuring. If you were to run your hand along the seam of a well-maintained cabin, you would feel the slight irregularities where the hand of the builder had pressed a bit harder or smoothed a curve. These were the signatures of the family, a tactile record of their labor. In the dim light of a winter evening, the walls would catch the glow of the fire, the pale daubing standing out against the dark, seasoned logs like ribbons of light. It made the room feel larger, more intentional. It gave the space a sense of finish, a dignity that was hard-won through the sweat of the autumn months. The ritual of the autumn inspection was perhaps the most important day of the year. They would wait for the first truly cold day, when the wind was biting and the ground was beginning to harden. The whole family would step outside, squinting against the bright, gray sky, and walk slowly around the cabin. They were looking for the weeping of the walls, places where moisture had collected in cracks and then frozen, pushing the daubing out. They would carry their buckets of stones and their vats of clay like a medical team tending to a patient. I have always admired the cooperation this required, the way the elder son would climb the ladder to reach the high gables, while the younger children mixed the mud below. It was a generational transfer of skill, a lesson in how to hold back the dark And yet, despite all their efforts, the cabin was never perfectly quiet. The wind was a persistent ghost, always looking for a way in. It would find the keyhole, or the space under the door, or the tiny gap where the chimney met the roofline. It would make a low, whistling sound, a reminder that the siege was still ongoing. But as long as the daubing held and the fire burned, the family was safe. They would wrap themselves in their wool and sink into their feather beds, listening to the wood groan and the wind cry, knowing that they had done their part. The walls were tight, the stones were solid, and the mud was dry. The breath of winter was held at bay, and the long night could finally begin in peace. I want you to imagine the light as it fades in late October, that thin, silver light that barely warms the skin. You are standing in the center of the cabin, the floor under your feet still damp from the morning's work. The smell of wood smoke is beginning to dominate the scent of the mud. You reach out and touch a section of the daubing that you finished an hour ago. It is still cool, still soft, holding the heat of your hand for a moment before the winter takes it. You look up at the rafters, where the dark wood is already seasoned and hard, and you realize that you are standing inside a living creature, a shell made of the forest that is now breathing with your own lungs. The silence is profound. The wilderness is just a few inches away, pressing against the logs with all its weight, but it cannot get in. You have won the first battle of the season. We leave the walls now, those silent guardians of the perimeter, and move toward the source of the light itself. We turn our attention to the place where the fire lived and breathed, the metabolic heart of the home that turned the wooden box into a sanctuary. We move toward the hearth, where the stones are waiting to be warmed and the clay is ready to be fired by the heat of survival. This is the story of the chimney, the dangerous and essential engine of the frontier. The transition from the walls to the fireplace was a movement from the shield to the heart. For a cabin without a hearth was nothing more than a cold wooden box in a world of ice. In the early 1800s, the fireplace was not a luxury or a decorative feature. It was the metabolic engine of the entire family, providing the heat for survival, the light for work, and the energy for every meal they consumed. Honestly, I have always been struck by the sheer bravery of the construction of these early fireplaces, especially in the remote frontier where stone was sometimes a rarity. While a stone chimney was the dream of every settler, many had to settle for a far more dangerous and temporary solution known as the cat and clay chimney. This was a structure built entirely of wood and mud, a chimney made of sticks that lived in constant, intimate contact with the very fire it was meant to contain. I want you to think about the materials for a moment. Imagine the sticks. These were not just random twigs, but carefully selected poles of green oak or hickory, wood that was still full of moisture and less likely to burn immediately. They were cut to length and stripped of their smaller branches, leaving a smooth and solid skeleton. And then there was the clay, the heavy, gray earth that had to be armor for the wood. The construction of one of these chimneys was a communal and physically demanding ritual. They would start by building a wooden framework, lashing the poles together with leather thongs or hemp rope to create a rectangular cage. This was the stick part of the equation, a ladder-like tower that reached up through the roof into the winter sky. It looked fragile, a thin wooden spine against the massive trees of the forest. But it was the foundation for everything. But to keep the wood from turning into a bonfire, they had to armor it with the earth. This is where the cats came in. A cat was a roll of clay mixed with straw, roughly the size of a large loaf of bread. Imagine the family gathered at the base of the chimney, trampling the wet clay with their bare feet until it was a thick and sticky mass. I can almost feel the cold, heavy weight of the mud against the skin, and the sharp poke of the straw as it was kneaded into the mix. You would reach into the pile and pull out a mass of clay, rolling it between your palms until it became a smooth, heavy cylinder. These cats were the bricks of the frontier, wet and pliable and full of potential. They would take these rolls and wrap them around the wooden poles, pressing them together until they formed a continuous, solid wall of mud. Think about the clay itself for a moment. This was not the refined material of a potter's studio. It was the raw, unwashed soil from the banks of a nearby creek. It was rich with iron and silica, giving it a deep, gray-red color that turned into a scorched tan when it was fired. As you rolled the cats, you would feel the microscopic shards of stone and sand against your palms, a gritty texture that grounded you to the very land you were trying to master. The heat of your own hands would begin to dry the outer layer of the mud, leaving a dusty white film on your skin that smelled like wet stone and ancient minerals. This was the clay that would hold the fire of your survival. The work was slow and meticulous, as they had to build the chimney in layers. You could not build it all at once, or the weight of the wet clay would cause the whole structure to collapse in a messy heap of sticks and mud. You would build a few feet of the wall and then wait, letting the sun and the wind draw the moisture out of the clay until it was firm enough to support the next layer. Imagine the patience of that work, sitting by the half-finished hearth and watching the mud dry, knowing that the first frost was only days away. Once the interior of the flue was built, they would line it with a thick coat of pure, smooth clay, smoothing it with their hands until it was as slick as glass. This was the most important part, the barrier that kept the sparks from reaching the wooden framework. I find it terrifying to think about sleeping in a room where the only thing between you and a house fire is a few inches of dried mud. The pioneers lived with this anxiety every single day, and they developed a tool that was as essential as the fireplace itself, the pry pole. The pry pole was a long, heavy beam of seasoned wood, perhaps 10 or 12 feet long, that sat just outside the cabin, always within reach of the hearth. Its purpose was simple but desperate. If the clay lining of the chimney cracked and the wooden sticks began to smolder, the father would rush outside, jam the pole into the base of the chimney, and use his entire body weight to push the structure away from the cabin. The chimney would topple over and fall into the snow, burning on the ground while the cabin remained safe. Imagine waking up in the middle of a blizzard to see your only source of heat lying in the yard, a pile of smoldering sticks, but knowing that at least your children were still under a roof. This was the precarious nature of frontier life, where survival often meant choosing the lesser of two tragedies. You would stand in the door, the freezing air rushing into the cabin, and watch your chimney die in the snow, and you would feel a profound sense of relief. You were alive, and the walls were still standing. You would spend the next few days in the cold, shivering under every blanket you owned, while you worked frantically to build a new chimney before the next storm arrived. But even with its risks, the fireplace was a place of profound beauty and warmth. A well-designed firebox had a specific geometry that we have largely forgotten today. The back wall would not be straight, but would tilt slightly forward as it rose, creating a reflective surface that bounced the infrared heat of the coals back into the room. This was the radiant heat that could penetrate your heavy wool clothes and warm you to the bone. Honestly, there is no modern heater that can replicate the feeling of sitting in front of a massive stone or clay hearth. You can feel the heat hitting your face like a physical wave, a living pressure of warmth that makes your skin tingle, while the back of your head remains cool in the shadows. Think about the fire itself, the way it lived in the firebox. In the center, there was the white-hot core of the coals, a place where the temperature was high enough to melt lead. Surrounding that was the orange and yellow dance of the primary flames, licking at the dry wood, and at the base, where the air was sucked into the heat, there were the thin, ghostly blue flames that signified a perfect combustion. The light was never steady. It pulsed with the rhythm of the burning wood, a golden heartbeat for the house. The hearthstone was the center of the family's world, a massive slab of flat rock, often a single piece of slate or granite, that sat in front of the firebox. This stone would absorb the heat of the fire throughout the day, becoming a massive thermal battery that stayed warm for hours after the flames died down. In the evening, the children would sit on the hearthstone to warm their feet before bed, their small toes pressing against the rough stone, and the cat would curl up in the corner, eyes closed, in absolute contentment. I love the smell of a frontier hearth, a complex aroma that tells the story of the season. It was the scent of burning hickory, a sweet and heavy smoke that lingered in the rafters. It was the faint smell of drying herbs, sage and thyme and mint, hanging from the ceiling in bundles. It was the earthy smell of the clay lining as it baked under the heat, a scent like the first rain on a dry road. It was the smell of safety, the scent of a world that was under control, even while the wind roared through the chimney pots. You would breathe in that smell and feel your lungs relax, your whole body settling into the peace of the home. The firebox itself had to be large enough to hold the massive backlog we discussed, but small enough to maintain a strong draft. The draft was the lifeblood of the fire, the invisible current of air that pulled the smoke up the flue and kept the oxygen flowing to the coals. You could hear the draft on a cold night, a low, rushing sound like a distant river, as the fire sucked the air from the room and sent it into the sky. If the chimney was built correctly, the smoke would rise in a steady, silver column, disappearing into the dark sky. But if the wind shifted or the flue was cold, the smoke would tumble back into the room, filling the air with a stinging gray haze that made everyone cough and their eyes water. The pioneers learned to read the smoke like a language. They knew that a thin, blue smoke meant the fire was burning hot and clean, while a thick, black smoke meant the wood was damp and the heat was being wasted. They knew when to add a log or when to bank the coals based on how the air was moving through the chimney. They would watch the way the sparks danced in the firebox, seeing the patterns of the wind before they could even feel them. It was a constant conversation with the atmosphere, a delicate balancing act between the need for warmth and the need for breathable air. Maintaining the fireplace was a never-ending ritual that required both bravery and strength. Every few months, someone would have to climb up onto the roof, the wood slippery with frost or snow, and scrape the soot from the flue using a bundle of pine branches or a heavy chain. This soot was creosote, a flammable tar that could ignite and cause a chimney fire that even a pry pole could not stop. You would hear the creosote begin to roar in the flue, a sound like a freight train coming through the house, and you would know that you were in trouble. Think about that soot for a moment. The fine, velvet texture of the carbon as it accumulated on the walls of the chimney. It was a blacker than black material, staining the hands and the clothes of anyone who touched it. It smelled of deep, old fire and ancient forests. When you scraped it away, it would fall in thick, heavy flakes, like a dark snow landing in the ash of the hearth. This was the waste product of your survival, the ghost of the trees you had burned to keep the frost at bay. As the sun set and the temperature dropped toward zero, the fireplace took on a new and more solemn purpose. It was no longer a place of work, but a guardian of the night. The family would gather around for the final ritual of the day, the banking of the fire. This was the moment when the daytime fire was put to sleep, tucked away under a blanket of ash to preserve its life until the morning. They would watch as the father moved the glowing coals, his face illuminated by the soft red light, working with a focus that bordered on the religious. Every movement was deliberate, designed to preserve the spark of life. I want you to visualize the way the embers glow in the dark, like a fallen constellation of tiny red stars resting in the gray ash. This was the true metabolic heart of the cabin, the pulse that beat through the long, frozen hours. In those moments of quiet before sleep, the fireplace provided a sense of continuity that is hard to find in our modern world. The fire you banked tonight was the direct descendant of the fire you lit when you first arrived at the clearing months or years ago. It had been fed and nurtured every day, a single thread of warmth that connected the days and the seasons together. It was the one thing that never truly went out, a living presence that watched over the family while they slept. The smoke rising from the chimney was a signal to the wilderness that humanity was here, that they had claimed this small patch of earth and that they would not be moved by the cold. It was a defiant and beautiful signal, a white plume against the dark winter sky. Even in the middle of the night, if a traveler was lost in the woods, they would see that smoke and know that there was a hearth and a bed nearby. It was a beacon of civilization in a world of ice. As you prepare for sleep tonight, I want you to feel that same steady heat in your own mind. Imagine the warmth of the hearthstone radiating through your feet and up through your legs, loosening the tension in your muscles and slowing the rhythm of your heart. The danger of the sticks and mud is far away, and only the comfort of the fire remains. The drafts are sealed, the chimney is drawing well, and the fire is tucked safely under its blanket of ash. You are resting in the heart of the home, and the house is breathing with you. The silence of the night is not empty. It is filled with the soft hum of the smoldering coals and the peaceful presence of the stones. Imagine the feeling of the heavy, cold air pressing against the outside of the cabin, while you are cocooned in the radiant warmth of the clay walls. You can hear the wind whistling around the corners of the logs, but it sounds like a lullaby now, a distant song that cannot reach you. Your breathing is slow and steady, matching the slow smolder of the backlog. You are safe. You are warm. You are part of the long history of the hearth. We leave the fireplace now, its work done for the evening, and we move toward the final refuge, the layers of wool and feather where the body's own fire is kept safe. We move toward the bed, the nest of survival where the pioneers finally found their rest. Honestly, there is something deeply sacred about the final moments of a frontier fire. And if you were standing there with me, in the shivering silence of a January midnight, you would feel the weight of the darkness pressing against the window glass like a physical hand. The transition of the fire from a daytime blaze to a nightly smolder was not just a chore. It was a ritual of absolute necessity that determined whether the family would wake to the soft light of morning or the blue stillness of a house that had grown too cold. As the sun dipped below the jagged line of the frozen forest, the fire was required to undergo a transformation, for the leaping flames that cooked the evening stew were far too hungry for the long hours of the night. During the day, the fire was a wild thing, consuming wood with a rapid and crackling appetite. But for the night, it had to be tamed and slowed, reduced to a steady heart that would beat under a blanket of ash. I have always found it strange and beautiful that the very element that brings life must be buried in its own remains to survive until the dawn, and the process of banking the fire was the primary tool the pioneers used to manage their limited resources. The first step in this nightly alchemy was the preparation of the backlog, and I want you to imagine the physical presence of this massive piece of wood, for it was the true anchor of the home. The backlog was usually a heavy log of seasoned hickory or white oak, chosen in the autumn and set aside specifically for the coldest weeks of the year. Hickory was the king of the hearth, a wood so dense and heavy that it felt like lifting a stone when you carried it from the woodpile. You would feel the rough, dry texture of the bark against your palms, smelling the faint scent of the deep woods and the bitter tang of the sap that had long since turned to energy. Think about the internal structure of that log. The tightly packed rings of cellulose and lignin that had spent 100 years growing under the summer sun, slowly gathering the power of the light into its fibers. Now, in the dead of winter, that stored energy was the only thing standing between the family and the ice. The father would place this log at the very rear of the firebox, resting it firmly against the back wall of the fireplace where the stones had been baking in the heat all through the afternoon. This log served as a thermal shield, protecting the masonry from the most intense heat, while acting as a slow-burning battery that would radiate a gentle warmth for 8 or 10 hours. Once the backlog was in place, the arrangement of the coals began, and the sound of the iron poker scraping across the hearth was the final music of the day. The family would watch in the dim light as the glowing embers were raked forward, away from the back wall, until they formed a mound in the center of the firebox. These coals were a brilliant and pulsing red, like a collection of tiny suns resting in a bed of gray, and if you leaned close, you could feel the intense infrared energy hitting your skin with a dry and searing pressure. Each coal was a masterpiece of heat, a fragment of the day's fire that had been distilled into its purest form. But if left exposed to the air, these coals would burn themselves out within an hour, their energy vanishing into the chimney in a frantic rush. To prevent this, they had to be insulated. The pioneers used the ash, the fine and velvet powder left over from previous fires, to create a protective shroud. They would take a heavy shovel and spread the ash over the coals, covering them completely until the light vanished and only a few thin ribbons of blue smoke remained. This blanket of ash was a masterpiece of thermal engineering. as it restricted the flow of oxygen to the fire, just enough to keep the combustion alive without letting it accelerate. Beneath the ash, the coals would enter a state of suspended animation, slowly eating into the face of the backlog and maintaining a core of heat that would never fully dissipate. I have always found it fascinating how much patience this requires. The ability to hide your light so that it may last longer. The heat from this banked fire was not the intense heat of the day, but a soft and radiant glow that moved in straight lines, warming the logs of the walls and the legs of the chairs until the entire room felt like a warm stone. This was the thermal battery of the cabin at work, the wood and the mud absorbing the energy of the smolder and releasing it back into the room as the outside temperature dropped towards sub-zero. You can imagine the air in the room turning heavy and still, the sound of the wind outside becoming a distant memory as the radiant heat filled the space between the walls. The physical chemistry of this process is quite beautiful if you slow down to observe it. The carbon in the wood does not burn with a flame, but instead it glows, a process known as surface combustion. When the oxygen molecule penetrates the layer of ash, it touches the hot carbon and creates carbon dioxide, releasing a tiny pulse of heat that is immediately absorbed by the surrounding embers. This creates a self-sustaining cycle that can last for the entire night, a low-energy broadcast of warmth that reaches out to the sleepers in their beds. If you were to walk across the room in the dark, you might see a single, tiny red eye peeking through the gray dust, a sign that the heart was still beating. It was a reassuring sight, a reminder that the home was still alive, still fighting the cold of the Little Ice Age. I want you to imagine the silence that followed the banking of the fire, for it was a silence that felt heavy and safe. The room was no longer illuminated by the dancing orange light of flames, but was instead a landscape of deep shadows and the faint, rhythmic ticking of the wood as it settled. You would lie in the dark and listen to the house breathe, hearing the occasional click of a coal shifting under the ash, or the groan of a rafter as the frost tightened its grip on the roof. These sounds were not frightening. They were the evidence of the house doing its job, the evidence that the fire was still there, tucked away like a sleeping animal. If the fire went out, the cabin would lose its pulse, and the silence would change from a warm comfort to a cold dread. The air would grow sharp and thin, and you would feel the moisture of your own breath freezing on the blankets. But as long as that backlog glowed, the family was protected. The morning revival of the hearth was the mirror image of the nightly banking, and it was the first duty of the new day. The cabin would be freezing, with the wash basin, a solid block of ice, and the breath of the family visible in the gray light of dawn. The father would step onto the cold floorboards, his feet numb and the wood biting at his skin, and approach the fireplace to uncover the secret. He would take the poker and carefully pull back the ash. And there, in the center of the pit, he would find the glowing red heart of the coals, still alive and still warm after all those hours. It must have felt like a miracle every single morning, the realization that the fire had stayed with them through the dark. He would add small, dry shavings of pine or cedar, their oils catching the heat and turning it into a bright, yellow flame. He would blow softly on the embers, his own breath acting as the fuel that brought the world back to life. Then he would build the fire back up, feeding it larger and larger pieces of wood until the cabin began to thaw and the sounds of the morning could begin. This cycle of banking and reviving was the true metabolic rhythm of the frontier, a constant conversation between the family and the earth. They understood that warmth was not something that was given, but something that was earned through vigilance and care. Every log they cut, every shovel of ash they moved, was a payment to the winter, a way of buying another night of safety. Honestly, when we think about our modern lives, we forget the physical weight of survival, the way a single piece of hickory could be the difference between a restful sleep and a struggle for breath. The fire was the heart of the home, but it was a heart that had to be tended with a steady hand and a patient mind. As the night deepened, the banked fire became a guardian, its radiant heat a barrier against the absolute zero of the wilderness. The pioneers knew that they were living on a thin line, separated from the Ice Age by only a few inches of wood and a pile of glowing coals. This knowledge gave their sleep a quality of profound peace, for they had done everything within their power to secure their world. The backlog was solid, the ash was thick, and the heart was steady. The house was no longer just a structure. It was a living organism, breathing with the rhythm of the fire and the seasons. The scent of the smoldering wood would linger in the hair and the blankets of the sleepers, a comforting perfume of survival that stayed with them throughout the night. Imagine the feeling of the heavy, cold air pressing against the outside of the logs, while you are cocooned in the radiant warmth of the clay hearth. The walls of the fireplace, made of limestone or mud, would continue to radiate their stored energy long after the flames had vanished. This is the beauty of the stone, its ability to remember the heat and share it with the world. You could lean your back against the chimney wall and feel the deep, penetrating warmth that reached all the way to your bones. In the silence of the night, this was the only touch that mattered, the only evidence that you were not alone in the vast, white wilderness. We leave the hearth now, with its red stars hidden in the gray, and we move toward the only other refuge the family had, the layered and intricate system of the bed where the fire of the body itself was kept alive. The transition to the bed was the final act of the evening, a movement into a world of fiber and fluff that was just as complex as the fireplace. If the fire was the generator of heat, the bed was the capacitor, the system that captured and held that energy so it would not be lost to the rafters. I want you to feel the stillness of the room as you prepare to leave the warmth of the hearthstone. The floor is cold, but the bed is waiting, a nest of survival that has been prepared with as much care as the fire itself. The layers of the mattress and the weight of the blankets are ready to receive you, ready to hold you in a state of suspended rest until the morning light returns to the sky. Let the rhythm of your own heart slow down as you think about the smoldering embers, for you are now entering your own state of banking, your own time of quiet preservation. The night is yours, and the fire is watching over you. Honestly, if you were to run your fingers across the heavy oak posts of a frontier bed, you would feel the ridges and scars of a piece of furniture that was built to withstand the pressure of 1,000 winter nights. The movement from the fireplace to the bed was the final migration of the day, a transition into the deepest core of the home, where the only warmth left was the energy generated by the family themselves. I want you to visualize the way the room looks when the candles are out and only the faint, pulsing warmth of the hearth remains. You would feel the cold air pressing against your skin, urging you to seek the sanctuary of the mattresses. The bed was not just a place to sleep. It was a specialized habitat, a nest designed to capture and hold every single watt of energy the human body produced. In the 1800s, they understood that once you left the radius of the fire, you were the only furnace you had, and the bedding was the insulation that prevented your warmth from vanishing into the rafters. This system was built in layers, each one serving a specific purpose, and the construction of these layers was the result of centuries of trial and error in the coldest climates of the world. The foundation of the entire system was the rope bed, and I want you to think about the journey of the hemp fibers that made up those cords. The plants were grown in the summer sun, their long stalks retted in water and broken by hand to reveal the strong inner strands that were twisted into the thick, gray rope. This rope was threaded through the holes in the bed rails in a tight grid pattern, creating a platform that was suspended above the floor. The tension in these ropes was the secret to a good night, for if the cords were loose, the bed would sag, and you would find yourself rolled into a cold and uncomfortable pile in the center of the frame. This is where the phrase "sleep tight" was born, as the family would use a wooden bed wrench to tighten the ropes before the winter set in, ensuring that the platform was as solid and level as the floor itself. You can imagine the loud creak of the hemp as it was pulled tight, a sound like a ship straining against its anchors, a promise of a stable and supportive rest. The ropes held the mattresses off the floor, keeping the sleepers above the pool of freezing air that settled near the ground and allowing the warmth of the room to circulate beneath them. Resting directly on the ropes was the coarsest layer, the straw tick, and I can almost hear the loud, dry crunch of the stalks as you sit down on the bed. Imagine a field of wheat in August, the golden stems standing tall and hollow, drinking the heat of the summer sun. When the grain was harvested, these stalks were saved and dried until they were brittle and light, each one containing a tiny chamber of air. The tick was a large bag made of heavy cotton or linen, stuffed full of these dried golden stems until it was 4 or 5 inches thick. The beauty of straw was its loft, the millions of tiny air pockets trapped within the hollow stalks that resisted the movement of heat. But straw was a noisy companion, and every time you shifted in your sleep, the mattress would rustle and crackle, a sound that became the background music of the frontier night. Over the course of the winter, the straw would flatten and compress under the weight of the sleepers, and so the family would have to empty the tick and refill it with fresh, springy stalks every season to maintain the insulation. Above the straw came the more refined layers, the mattresses filled with wool or horsehair. Wool shorn from the family's own sheep was carded by hand using wooden cards with sharp wire teeth, a process that cleaned the fibers and aligned them into soft, airy clouds. You could smell the lanolin and the earthy scent of the animal as the cards moved back and forth, creating a pad that was resilient and warm. Wool was a precious material, valued for its ability to stay warm even when damp, and its natural spring that prevented it from bunching up like the straw. If a family was particularly fortunate, they might have a mattress filled with horsehair, which was collected from the manes and tails of their animals. Horsehair was firm and almost springy, providing an excellent level of support and durability that could last for decades without degrading. These middle layers were the armor of the bed, providing the stability and the primary insulation that kept the cold of the floor from reaching the sleepers above. But the crown jewel of the frontier bed was the feather bed, and honestly, if you have never seen one, it is hard to describe the sheer volume of soft warmth it provided. This was not a mattress in the modern sense, but a massive, quilted tick filled with the down and feathers of geese or ducks. Imagine the life of a goose on the frontier, its thick layer of down protecting it from the icy water of the pond. Each cluster of down is a masterpiece of nature, a tiny central point with thousands of microscopic filaments that reach out to trap the air. A single feather bed represented years of plucking and stripping, a task that was often done by the fire during the long winter evenings. The family would sit together, taking each feather and stripping the soft barbs away from the stiff central quill, a process that was slow and repetitive but absolutely essential for comfort. If you left the quills in, the bed would be full of sharp needles that would jab you through the ticking. But a bed filled with pure down was a cloud of absolute silence and warmth. You would sink into the feathers until they wrapped around the sides of your body, creating a customized pocket of air that would stay at exactly your own body temperature all night long. The maintenance of the feather bed was a daily ritual for the women of the house, for the down would shift and clump during the night. Every morning, after the fire was revived, the bed would be fluffed and shaken, the heavy tick being tossed and turned until the feathers were evenly distributed and the loft was restored. If you did not fluff it, the bed would lose its power to hold heat, and you would wake up feeling the hard wool below. I love the image of the mother shaking the bed in the morning light, a cloud of fine dust and tiny stray feathers floating in the air, a physical manifestation of the care required to keep a family alive. The bed was a biological machine, a system of air and fiber that allowed the family to rest in a world that never stopped trying to freeze them. The fabrics worn to bed were just as important as the layers underneath, for the skin itself had to be protected from the biting air of the room. They wore linsey woolsey, a coarse blend of linen for strength and wool for warmth, creating a heavy and stiff garment that would eventually soften after years of wear. Imagine the process of creating this cloth, for it was a labor that spanned the entire calendar. In the early spring, the family would prepare the soil for the flax, planting the small seeds in neat rows and watching for the delicate blue flowers to bloom in the summer wind. When the stalks were tall and golden, they were pulled from the earth and soaked in the river to rot the outer skin, a process called retting that smelled of the deep mud and the moving water. The fibers were then broken and combed until they were as fine as silk, ready to be spun into the strong threads that formed the backbone of the fabric. At the same time, the sheep were shorn of their thick winter coats, the wool being washed in hot water and soap to remove the dirt and the grease of the pasture. The spinning wheel and the loom were the constant companions of the pioneer woman, the rhythmic hum of the wheel and the heavy thud of the loom, providing the soundtrack for the winter months. To make linsey woolsey, the linen threads were used for the warp, the long strands that were stretched tight on the loom, while the soft wool yarn was woven back and forth as the weft. The result was a fabric that was incredibly durable, able to withstand the friction of the straw and the ropes, while providing a layer of insulation that modern cotton can never match. Men and women wore long nightshirts that reached to their ankles, and the sleeves were tied at the wrists to keep the heat inside. And then there was the nightcap, which I have always found to be the most sensible invention of the past. Your head is a giant radiator, and if you leave it exposed to a room that is 40 degrees, you will lose your heat faster than the fire can replace it. Everyone wore a close-fitting cap of flannel or knitted wool, pulling it down over their ears until they were a sealed vessel of life. Footwear was just as important. for the feet were the first to feel the pull of the cold floor. Hand-knitted stockings of heavy wool were pulled up to the knees, often 2 pairs deep on the coldest nights, and some families even wore soft moccasins or felted slippers to bed. You would tuck your feet into the straw and the feathers, and then the final layer of blankets would be lowered onto the sleepers. These were not thin sheets, but heavy wool coverlets, often woven in intricate patterns of blue and red, and on top of those would go the quilts. Each quilt was a history of the family, made of scraps of old dresses and worn-out coats, all of them stitched together into a dense and heavy layer of protection. The weight of the blankets was a comfort in itself, a physical pressure that held the body still and reminded you that you were safely buried in the center of the bed. I want you to think about the pre-warming rituals that happened just before they climbed into this nest. They would take smooth river rocks or pieces of soapstone and place them near the hearth until they were almost too hot to touch. Imagine the scene: the firelight reflecting off the surface of the stones, the scent of the heated minerals filling the air. These stones were wrapped in scraps of old wool or pieces of worn-out flannel and tucked down into the foot of the bed, creating a small island of intense heat where the feet would rest. When you finally climbed under the heavy quilts, you would search for that stone with your toes, feeling the dry and steady warmth radiate through your stockings and up your legs. It was a sensation of pure relief, the feeling of the frost being driven back by the stolen heat of the fire. Some families had copper warming pans, beautiful tools with long wooden handles and perforated lids. You would see the mother filling the pan with glowing embers from the hearth, the soft red light illuminating her face as she worked. She would slide the pan between the sheets, moving it back and forth in a slow and rhythmic motion, the scent of heated metal and warm blankets filling the air. You would see the steam rise from the fabric as the moisture of the room was driven away, leaving the bed crisp and dry and inviting. This was the final payment to the night, a bit of the hearth carried into the bed to bridge the gap until the body heat took over. Honestly, there is no modern comfort that can compare to the feeling of a pre-warmed bed on a sub-zero night, a small and tangible evidence of the care that went into the ritual of survival. Once the family was tucked in, they often relied on the most ancient source of heat of all, which was each other. In the frontier cabin, privacy was a luxury that no one could afford when the thermometer dropped below zero. Children would be packed 3 or 4 to a bed, their small bodies huddled together like a litter of puppies, sharing their warmth and their breath under the heavy quilts. You would learn to sleep in a tangle of limbs and soft snoring, the collective life of the family creating a microclimate of safety. The body of a resting adult produces about 100 watts of heat, and when you combine that with the heat of siblings and parents, the bed becomes a powerful furnace. They would pull the covers over their heads, breathing the warm and recycled air, listening to the wind howl against the logs just inches away. I can imagine the sound of the cabin in the deep hours of the night, the rhythmic breathing of the family matching the slow groan of the logs. Outside, the little ice age was howling through the trees, snapping branches with the force of the frost and piling the snow against the door. But inside, the system was holding. The fire was smoldering under its ash. The walls were releasing their stored warmth. The feathers were trapping the air, and the wool was holding the body. You were part of a woven reality, a chain of materials and efforts that all pointed toward the single goal of reaching the morning. The darkness was absolute, but the warmth was certain. There was a profound sense of intimacy in this way of living, a connection to the physical reality of life that we have mostly lost. You knew the texture of the wool, the sound of the straw, the smell of the goose down, and the heat of the person lying next to you. As you lie here tonight, I want you to feel the hierarchy of that nest in your own mind. Imagine the solid support of the ropes, the springy loft of the straw, the firm resilience of the wool, and the soft embrace of the feathers. You are not just lying on a surface. You are cocooned in a multi-layered defense system that was built by hand and maintained with love. The cold air of the room might be touching your nose or your forehead, but the rest of your body is 1,000 miles away, protected by the wisdom of generations. The bed is your sanctuary, the final fortress of the night, and the silence of the cabin is the evidence of your safety. You can let your heart slow down now, matching the rhythm of the banked fire and the groaning wood, knowing that the nest is tight and the warmth is secure. The ice age is outside, but inside, you have everything you need to dream of the spring. Everything is quiet, everything is still, and the world is at peace. We leave the heavy warmth of the blankets now and move toward the final transition of our journey, the gray light of a winter morning and the rebirth of the home. The fabric of the frontier night was not something that was simply bought or bartered for. It was something that was grown, harvested, and woven by the very hands that would eventually pull it close in the shivering dark. Honestly, when I think about the sheer amount of human effort required to keep a body warm in the early 1800s, it makes our modern world of plastic zippers and synthetic fleeces feel almost ghostly and thin. Every nightshirt, every stocking, and every heavy nightcap began its life as a seed in the soil or a tuft of wool on a sheep's back. And the production of these garments was a labor of love and survival that lasted through every season of the long frontier year. The primary armor for the sleeping pioneer was a coarse and honest textile known as linsey-woolsey, a hybrid fabric that brought together the strength of the plant world and the warmth of the animal kingdom. I want you to imagine the life of a single nightshirt, for its story is the story of the family's endurance across the span of an entire year. In the early spring, as the ground began to thaw and the first robins returned to the trees, the family would plant a small plot of flax. You would see the tiny seeds being pressed into the damp earth, each one a promise of future warmth. They would watch as the delicate blue flowers bloomed in the summer sun, swaying in the breeze like a piece of the sky that had fallen to the earth. When the stalks turned golden and dry in the late summer heat, they were pulled from the ground by the roots and soaked in the slow, moving water of a nearby river. This process, called retting, was a slow and pungent transformation. For days or weeks, the flax would lie underwater, where natural bacteria would break down the woody outer bark to expose the long, silver fibers within. You can smell the scent of the river as you think of this, the smell of damp mud and decaying reeds, and the cold, mineral water that stays cool even in the height of August. Once the fibers were dried and combed through a bed of sharp metal teeth, they were spun into a thread that was as strong as iron, but as light as a whisper. The spinning wheel would hum a low and hypnotic tune in the corner of the cabin, the fiber twisting under the hand of the mother or the daughter until it became a steady line of silver. I have always found that sound to be the most soothing rhythm of the past, a sound that mimics the heartbeat of a sleeping child. This linen provided the skeleton of the fabric, the durable warp that would hold the garment together through years of hard use and heavy washing. At the same time, the family's sheep were shorn of their thick winter coats, the wool being washed in hot water and soaked to remove the lanolin and the grease of the pasture. I have always found the scent of raw wool to be deeply grounding, a mix of earth and rain, and the oily life of the animal that spent its days grazing in the silent valleys. The wool was carded until it was as soft and airy as a summer cloud, the wire teeth of the cards pulling the tangles apart until the fibers were all aligned in the same direction. Then, it too was spun into a thick, springy yarn that would serve as the weft of the linsey-woolsey. When the loom began its rhythmic work in the late autumn, the sound of the heavy wooden shuttle moving back and forth was the heartbeat of the home, a steady thud that promised a winter of safety. The linen warp and the woolen weft were pressed together until they formed a dense, scratchy shield that could capture the heat of the human body and hold it close to the skin, even when the air in the cabin was cold enough to turn your breath to ice. This cloth was not meant to be pretty. It was meant to be a barrier against the void. It was a material that carried the fingerprints of the family in every stitch, a tactile record of the hours spent by the fire and the sun. When you put on a nightshirt made of this material, you would feel its weight immediately, a heavy and stiff presence that refused to drape like the soft fabrics we know today. It was scratchy and rough, especially when it was new, but as you moved through the years, the fibers would soften and conform to your shape, becoming a second skin that was intimately familiar with your every movement. The garments were cut long, reaching to and the sleeves were tied at the wrists with small linen strings to prevent the freezing drafts from creeping up your arms. Men and women alike wore these heavy shifts, often adding a short bed jacket of wool or a shawl if the fire had been banked particularly low. You were not just wearing clothes. You were wearing a barrier, a woven fortress that allowed your biological furnace to keep the cold of the universe at a safe distance. But the most critical piece of this nightly armor, and perhaps the most misunderstood in our modern age, was the nightcap. Honestly, I have always found it strange that we have discarded such a vital tool for survival. For the human head is a giant radiator of heat that will dump your life's warmth into the rafters with a terrifying efficiency. Think for a moment about the biology of the head. The blood vessels near the surface of the scalp do not constrict in the cold as the vessels in your hands and feet do. This is a survival mechanism of the body, as the brain requires a constant and steady supply of oxygen and glucose, regardless of the weather. Because of this, your head remains warm and blood-rich, while the rest of you shivers, making it a chimney for your internal heat. The pioneers understood this instinctively, and they knew that if your head was exposed to a room that was 40 degrees, you would lose your core heat faster than any fireplace could replace it. Everyone in the family, from the smallest infant to the oldest grandfather, wore a close-fitting cap of flannel or knitted wool to bed, pulling it down over their ears and tying it under their chin. I want you to imagine the feeling of that nightcap, a soft and snug embrace that silenced the whistling of the wind and kept the heat of your thoughts where it belonged. You can feel the wool pressing against your temples, the texture of the knit providing a million tiny air pockets that act as a cushion of warmth. Without a nightcap, you would wake in the middle of the night with ears that felt like ice and a headache that reached into your very soul. But with the cap, you were a sealed vessel of life, a glowing ember tucked into a woolly nest. Footwear was the next layer of the defense, for the feet were the first to feel the cold pull of the floorboards. Hand-knitted stockings of heavy, dark wool were pulled up to the knees, often worn in 2 pairs on the most bitter nights of the year. You can imagine the feeling of the wool as it stretches over your heel and your toes, the thick yarn providing a springy layer of insulation between you and the cold. Some families even wore soft moccasins or felted slippers to bed, tucking their feet deep into the layers of straw and feathers until they were completely invisible. And then, once the body was armored and the feet were protected, the final layer of blankets would be lowered onto the sleepers. These were not the thin and airy sheets of today, but heavy wool coverlets woven in patterns of deep blue and red. And on top of those would go the quilts. I want you to think about the pre-warming rituals that happened just before the family climbed into this nest. For the blankets and the mattresses would be freezing to the touch if they were left alone in the dark corners of the room. The shock of the cold sheets could steal your breath away and make your heart race. And so they used the heat of the fire to prime the bed for the night. They had smooth, flat stones, often pieces of soapstone or river rock, that sat near the edge of the hearth all evening long, drinking in the infrared energy of the coals. Soapstone was the most prized for this, as it had a unique geological structure rich in talc and magnesium that allowed it to hold on to heat for hours, releasing it with a slow and steady radiation that felt like a warm hand. Just before bed, these stones would be wrapped in scraps of old flannel or heavy linen and tucked down into the foot of the bed. If you were the first person to climb under the covers, you would search for that stone with your toes, finding that hidden source of warmth and feeling the dry, steady heat radiate through your stockings and up your legs. It was a sensation of pure and absolute relief, the feeling of the frost being driven back by the stolen heat of the fire, a small and tangible evidence of the care that went into the ritual of survival. The stones were like quiet companions, guarding the cold border of the mattress while you drifted away. You can feel the tension in your toes just melt away as they touch that radiant warmth, a heat that travels up your shins and into your very core. Some wealthier families had copper warming pans, beautiful and perforated tools with long wooden handles that they would fill with glowing embers from the fireplace. The lids of these pans were often decorated with intricate patterns of holes, stars and flowers that served a dual purpose, letting the heat out while keeping the coals in. You would see the mother sliding the pan between the sheets, moving it back and forth in a slow and rhythmic motion, the scent of the heated metal and the warm wool filling the air like a perfume. You can hear the soft hiss of the coals and the rustle of the fabric as the moisture of the room was driven away, leaving the bed crisp and dry and inviting. This was the final payment to the night, a bit of the hearth carried into the bed to bridge the gap until the body heat took over. I find it so peaceful to think about the order of these things. First the flax in the dirt, then the sheep in the field, then the wool on the wheel, and finally the stone in the fire. Every single element of the world was recruited to protect the family from the Little Ice Age. There was a profound connection between the land and the sleeper, a sense that the earth itself was providing the tools for our survival. Every bit of warmth in the frontier cabin was a precious resource, borrowed from the fire and managed with a level of attention that we can barely imagine today. They were in a constant negotiation with the freezing night, using their bodies, their clothes, and their tools to maintain a survivable balance. As you lie here tonight, I want you to feel that same steady and radiating warmth in your own mind. Imagine the weight of the wool blankets pressing down on you, a physical pressure that holds you still and safe. Imagine the softness of the nightcap around your ears, silencing the noise of the world and keeping your internal fire steady. The drafts of the wilderness are far away, and the armor of the home is on. You can feel the tension in your shoulders melt away as you think of the pre-warmed sheets and the thick, scratchy wool. The cold is just a backdrop for your comfort. You are a child of the pioneers, a sleeper in the wool, and the night is your sanctuary. The stars are cold, the wood is groaning, but your nest is tight and your rest is certain. We leave the fabric of the night now and move toward the final refuge, the place where the human spirit and the human body came together to share their life in the dark. Think for a moment about the silence of the room as the family dressed for bed. There was no television, no hum of a computer, no light of a smartphone. There was only the sound of the fire and the rustle of the clothing. You would hear the faint snap of the linen strings being tied, the soft thud of a boot hitting the floor, and the quiet murmur of voices saying their prayers. The light was a warm and golden pulse, making everyone look soft and ethereal in the shadows. This was the moment of transition, the moment when the work of the day was put aside and the work of resting began. They were preparing for a journey into the dark, and they were taking every precaution to ensure their safe return. You can feel that same transition happening in your own body right now. The events of your day are fading into the background, becoming as distant as the fields of flax. Your focus is narrowing down to the feeling of your blankets and the sound of your own breath. You are building your own armor of silence, your own layer of peace. The room you are in is your fortress, and the story is your hearth. The pioneers are gone, but their wisdom remains, reminding us that even in the deepest winter, there is a way to stay warm. The heavy oak beams of the cabin were not just a house. They were a part of the family, and as the wood cooled and the fire smoldered, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. There is a quality of stillness that only exists in a house built by hand, a quality I call the museum hush. It is a silence that feels thick and textured, a silence that carries the weight of history. In that hush, the family would drift off, their minds turning to the simple joys of the next day, the smell of the morning coffee, and the sight of the sun on the snow. They were survivors, they were dreamers, and they were safe. We move forward now into the final part of our night, to see how the family used their own biological fire to conquer the frost, and how they found a democracy of warmth in the shared silence of the bed. The frontier cabin was a landscape of shared life, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the communal democracy of the bed, where the boundaries of the individual dissolved into the collective warmth of the family. In a world where the thermometer frequently dropped below zero, and the only source of heat was a smoldering log of hickory, privacy was a luxury that no one could afford to maintain. I want you to imagine the arrangement of the sleeping spaces in a single room that was only 12 feet wide, a room where every inch was a battlefield against the cold. The primary bed, with its high oak posts and its layers of feathers and wool, was the fortress of the household, and it often held as many people as the mattresses could possibly support. Parents and small children would huddle together under the same heavy quilts, their bodies forming a single unit of biological energy that was more powerful than any fire. Honestly, there is a profound beauty in this way of living, a connection to the physical reality of the people you love that we have mostly lost in our world of separate rooms and private spaces. You would learn the rhythm of your sister's breath and the weight of your brother's arm as he shifted in his sleep. And this closeness was not an intrusion, but a profound source of security. I want you to think about the science of this for a moment. The incredible power of the human body as an engine of heat. A resting human adult generates approximately 100 watts of heat, a steady broadcast of infrared energy that radiates from the core to the skin. When you pack 3 or 4 people into a single feather bed, you are creating a 400-watt furnace, a biological engine that can withstand even the most brutal of January blizzards. Think of your body as a small steam engine, burning the calories of the evening meal to keep the internal fires stoked. In that crowded bed, those 4 engines were all working together, sharing their exhaust, sharing their warmth, and creating a pocket of life that was 40 or 50 degrees warmer than the rest of the room. The heat trapped beneath the blankets becomes a tangible thing, a warm atmosphere that you can feel against your skin, heavy and sweet. They would pull the covers over their heads, breathing the warm and recycled air of their own small microclimate, listening to the wind roar against the logs just inches from their pillows. The thickness of the walls and the weight of the wool were the outer shells, but the people themselves were the heart of the machine, the source of the life that kept the frost at bay. There is something deeply reassuring about being part of a group like that, a sense that you are not alone in the face of the universe. Children who were too old for the main bed had their own places of survival, often on trundle beds that were pulled out from the dark spaces below the master frame. The trundle was a low and humble bed, built on small wooden wheels that would rattle and complain against the floorboards as it was hauled out into the light of the hearth. During the day, it lived in the shadows, tucked away out of sight. But at night, it was positioned near the fireplace where the hearthstones would radiate their stored warmth all through the long night. I can imagine the children scrambling into these pallets, their feet cold from the floorboards, finding the spots where the heat of the day still lingered in the clay and the stone. They would sleep in a tangle of limbs and soft snoring, the collective breath of the siblings creating a mist in the air that would slowly settle as frost on the edges of the blankets. They were wrapped in quilts made of the family's history, patterns like the log cabin or the Star of Bethlehem, each scrap of fabric telling a story of a grandmother's dress or a father's old coat. I have always found the log cabin pattern to be particularly poetic, with its central red square representing the hearth fire, surrounded by strips of light and dark fabric representing the logs and the shadows. To the women who stitched these quilts, the patterns were a form of prayer, a way of building a house out of cloth to protect their families from the storm. You could run your hand over the stitches and feel the texture of the different fabrics, the rough wool, the smooth cotton, the sturdy linen, all bound together into a single, heavy shield. Each stitch was a tiny anchor, holding the family together against the pull of the wilderness. If the cabin was particularly full with guests or travelers, the floor itself became a bed, with pallets made of folded quilts and straw ticks spread out in front of the fire. It was a world where hospitality meant sharing your warmth, where a stranger was invited into the very center of the home to ensure that they would see the morning sun. I have often thought about those strangers, arriving at a door in the middle of a blizzard, their eyebrows white with frost and their voices cracked by the wind. They would find themselves an hour later tucked into a bed with the children of the house, the shared warmth of humanity being the only currency that mattered. It was a level of trust and communal reliance that we can barely conceive of today, a reminder that on the frontier, we were all neighbors in the face of the cold. I want you to think about the sound of that cabin in the deepest hours of the night, for it was a silence that was never truly empty. You would hear the loud and sudden crack of a frozen branch snapping in the woods, a sound like a pistol shot that echoed through the clear and biting air. You might hear the distant, low boom of the river, ice cracking as the current shifted beneath it, a sound that made the ground tremble and the logs of the cabin vibrate. You would hear the heavy groan of the log walls as they shrunk and twisted in the sub-zero cold, the house itself protesting the weight of the winter. But beneath these sharp and sudden noises was the steady and comforting rhythm of the family breathing, a low and oceanic sound that was the evidence of their survival. You would drift in and out of a light sleep, always aware of the cold pressing against your nose or your forehead, but always secure in the knowledge that you were part of a whole. The night was a presence, a living thing that sat in the corners of the room, but it could not find its way into the nest. You might wake up for a moment and see the red glow of the banked fire through the gaps in the quilts, a steady heartbeat in the darkness. You would feel the person next to you move, a soft rustle of the straw as the feathers shifted inside their tick to conform to the shape of the body. You would pull the blankets a little tighter, sinking back into the soft cloud of down with a sigh of absolute contentment. You were safe, you were whole, and you were loved by the very people you were keeping warm. The morning light would arrive with a gray and hesitant glow, filtering through the small, thick windows and revealing the evidence of the battle that had been fought in the dark. You would wake to see a layer of white frost covering the interior of the walls, a delicate and crystalline map of the places where the heat had failed to reach. You might see the shapes of ferns or mountains or stars etched into the wood, made of the frozen moisture of your own breath. On the edges of your heavy quilts, the moisture would have frozen into tiny needles of ice, a silent witness to the freezing temperatures of the room. This was the landscape of the morning, a world that was beautiful but unforgiving. Outside, the river would be breathing its own mist, a thick white vapor rising from the dark water and settling on the trees like a second coat of snow. I have always found it incredible to think about the first person who would wake in that cabin, usually the father or the eldest son, who had to make the transition from the warmth of the feathers to the absolute zero of the floorboards. Imagine the feeling of your feet hitting that wood, the shock of the cold traveling up your legs and making your heart jump in your chest. You would rush to the fireplace, your movements hurried and efficient, and take the iron poker to uncover the secret of the hearth. You would feel the cold iron of the poker against your palm, a searing bite of metal that made your skin tingle and your muscles tighten. You would carefully pull back the blanket of gray ash, and there, in the center of the pit, you would find the glowing red heart of the coals, still alive and still pulsing with the energy of the previous day. It must have felt like a sacred moment, the realization that the fire had stayed with them, that the thread of life had not been broken by the frost. You would add small, dry shavings of cedar or pine, blowing softly on the embers until a tiny yellow flame licked the air and caught the resin. The smell of the cedar smoke would fill the room, a sharp and sweet perfume that signaled the beginning of the new day. Then, you would build the fire back up, adding larger logs and listening for the first cheerful crackle of the wood as it surrendered to the heat. The cabin would begin to breathe again, the frost on the walls starting to weep and run in small silver tracks as the temperature rose. You would hear the sound of the coffee beans being ground in a small wooden mill, a rhythmic crunching that promised a hot cup of comfort and the start of the morning labor. This cycle of banking and reviving, of huddling and waking, was the fundamental rhythm of frontier life, a constant and repetitive dance with the seasons. It was a life that required vigilance and effort, a life where warmth was not a button you pushed, but a state of being that you cultivated with your own hands. They accepted the cold not as an enemy, but as a condition of their existence, a partner that made the warmth feel all the more precious. In our modern world, we have achieved a level of comfort that the pioneers could never have imagined. But we have also lost that deep and intimate connection to the physical reality of our survival. We forget the weight of the wool, the scent of the hickory smoke, and the power of a shared breath in the dark. But as you lie here tonight, safe in your own room and tucked under your own blankets, you can still feel the echoes of that ancient strength. The history of the frontier is not just a story of maps and battles. It is a story of how humanity found a way to rest in the middle of a world that was trying to freeze them. It is a story of how a wooden box and a pile of stones were turned into a sanctuary of peace through the power of the human spirit and the cooperation of a family. The fire you are imagining tonight is the same fire that burned in those cabins, a flame that has been passed down through generations of dreamers and survivors. You are the descendant of people who knew how to sleep tight, who knew how to bank the fire, and who knew how to hold on to each other when the wind began to howl. The night is moving toward its end now, and the stars are starting to fade in the cold sky. But you do not need to wake just yet. You are still in the center of the nest, protected by the wisdom of the past and the stillness of the present. Your heart is slow and steady. Your limbs are heavy and relaxed, and the world is exactly as it should be. The Little Ice Age is a memory. The frontier is a ghost, but the warmth of the hearth is still here in your mind. Sink deeper into the mattress. Let the weight of the blankets pull you down into a deep and restorative sleep, and know that you are safe in the arms of the night. I want you to imagine the moon as it sets behind the line of the forest, a pale and cold silver that touches the snow and makes it glow like a field of diamonds. The sun is still beneath the horizon, gathering its strength to bring another day of light and wood smoke. The seasons will continue to turn. The cold will eventually give way to the heat of July, but the ritual of the home will remain. You are a part of that cycle, a part of the long and steady breathing of the world. There is no hurry, there is no worry, and there is no noise. There is only the peace of the ages, the comfort of the fire, and the safety of the nest. You can feel the heaviness of sleep taking over your thoughts, a soft and gray cloud that wraps around your mind and dissolves the edges of the room. The sound of the wind is a lullaby. The smell of the smoke is a memory, and the touch of the wool is a comfort. You are home. You are loved. You are at peace. The long winter night is almost over, and the spring is waiting for you in your dreams, with its fields of blue flax and its warm, golden sun. The fire is steady, the logs are thick, and the family is whole. Drift away now, into the silence, into the dark, into the rest that you have earned. The pioneers are watching over you. Their strength is your own, and the night is your sanctuary. Everything is as it was meant to be, a cycle of light and dark, of work and rest, of fire and ice. The story is finished. The labor is done, and the rest is yours to keep. Every breath you take is a rhythmic song of survival, a heartbeat for the world. Sleep now, and dream of the dawn. Good night.